All right, and welcome to our virtual panel. My name is Michael Clawson. I'm with Native American Art Magazine. This is the virtual panel for the American Indian Art Show San Francisco that's ongoing right now. Native American Art Magazine is a proud sponsor of that event, and they let us do these fun little virtual panels with them. And I'm excited to be here today, especially with these two distinguished guests. Starting off here, we have author, gallery owner, podcaster, Renaissance man, Mark Sublette from Tucson, Arizona. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you for having me. It's fun to be here. You left out pot washer at home.
And pot washer, yes. We also have Davison Koenig, who is the executive director of the Couse-Sharp Historic Site. Welcome, Davison.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be here.
Excellent. And our subject today is Merge Ahead, bringing together Western and Native American artwork within one collection. And the reason I asked both of you is you have a lot of experience with both Western and Native American material. And I think this is a great thing that we can talk about. And I really, I can't wait to hear your perspective on it. I wanted to start kind of at the beginning. How much, and I know this might be a more complex question, but is there a long history of Western and Native American art collecting together? And I had kind of mentioned yesterday, you know, maybe Fred Harvey and some of the train, you know, the railroads that were coming out west. Is that sort of the beginning of art collecting in the West? Do either one of you have any information on that?
Well, one of the things I've seen is what they used to call the Indian room. So at the turn of the century, you would often find these collectors that would, because they felt like Indian material and art was going to be a lost art form, that they would collect them, often baskets, pottery, just about everything, right? And they would designate a single room in their house that would just be filled with it. And I've seen at least 2 times in my career where the original owners, you know, their grandparents, still had their Indian room in completely intact. And it was like a little museum. And it was pretty, in those 2 cases, it was all Native American stuff, or pretty much early, but some of it was of the time and some photographs, but not really many paintings, if any paintings that I can remember, and no Native American painting. So at least anecdotally from those Indian rooms that I've seen in the past and read about, I mean, I think it was a fairly common occurrence, not only in the West, but one of the ones I saw was actually in Pennsylvania.
And Davison, I mean, Taos has always been a great place to buy art and see art. Do you have much experience? I mean, it was always certainly a great place to buy Western art. What's your perspective on sort of the history there of collecting?
Well, the history of collecting, certainly in the West, and Taos in particular, goes way back. Taos was one of the most important trade centers in the West in the 18th and 19th century. Up until really the Mexican period, Taos was the place to find native material because most of the trade was native. It was the Comanche, the Ute, Navajo, Apache, and Pueblo peoples all coming together to trade at the Taos trade fairs. And so that's really where it largely begins in the West, going back pretty early. And then, of course, the Taos Society of Artists arriving in the early 20th century, late 19th. You know, that's what drives them here, is that rich cultural diversity, the majority being the native cultures, and Taos being the epicenter for that. So that collecting, you know, it happens, you know, and I would say even aggressively pretty early. Couse-Sharp in particular had huge Native American collections. Fortunately, most of that Couse collection is still here at the Couse-Sharp Historic Site in the Couse home and studio. Sharp largely gets rid of his collection at the end of his life, the bulk of which winds up at the Gilcrease, thanks to his relationship with Thomas Gilcrease and him building his new museum. But yeah, that's nothing new. And as Mark referenced, those Indian rooms, those Indian curios, you know, that's kind of coming out of the late Victorian period, where previously everyone was collecting Asia. And then this is the rise of the arts and crafts movement. And of course, Native American culture fits squarely within that ethos. And then you combine Santa Fe Railway and the marketing of the Southwest and Fred Harvey, Frank Simpson bringing those materials back east creates a real large appetite, hunger, market for those native material culture. And so when does the collection of the painting, I think happens kind of at the same time when these artists, and mostly from back east, are coming out west to paint the West. And often, as in the case of the Taos Society of Artists and the Santa Fe painters, largely painting Native American culture and or Hispano culture.
And
Davison, since we're talking about, oh, go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because if we're going to get Taos founders in, we've got to get Maynard Dixon in, right, too?
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah,
you know, Maynard had this
kind of floats around all of that.
Yeah, Maynard had the same thing in his studio. It was filled with Native American art. If you came into his studio, you would see this big buffalo skull that was on his studio door with a big blue circle that he would have. So you would know that you have arrived to Maynard Dixon's studio. And then, you know, April 18th of 1906, you have the great earthquake. And, you know, as he's trying to escape his house and almost gets killed, he's running to his studio, not to get his paintings, not to get his artwork, but to get all the Native American material. And a lot of it was coming from Hubbell. And Dixon was buying and selling and helping Hubbell sell his textiles. So he, you know, he couldn't afford to lose that. Plus, a lot of it was his own stuff. So he's got this great drawing that is in our museum that shows him running with the bull, with the buffalo skull on the back of his back, and you know, basically kachinas and blankets. And he just let everything go up in smoke. And he just said, listen, I can get and paint more paintings. I can't let this other stuff go. This is too important. So, I mean, at that time, that's, you know, 1906, you know, clearly there was interest and value to Native American arts by, at least in this case, another artist. And I think in what Davison was saying, you know, with Taos and Sharp and all these guys, they all valued it greatly.
Davison, I was going to ask you, because you know you're very, you know Couse-Sharp very well, and also the Taos founders, and you also just had your Lunder Research Center open, which sort of is a great library for some of these materials. What were their early collections like? Were they collecting materials for their paintings, or were they collecting materials because they were interested in pottery or weavings or baskets? What was sort of like, do you have any sense of why they were acquiring these things?
Yeah, I mean, they were acquiring them for both as material for paintings, but most importantly, Couse, for example, is a great example. I mean, he collects 152 large vessels, representing basically the 8 northern Pueblos, Zuni and Hopi. So of those 152, maybe a dozen appear in paintings. So that tells us, and he builds out his studio, his adobe walls, he builds out to put a shelf wrapping around so that he can surround himself with his pottery collection. And it's a pretty exquisite collection. He's an artist buying directly from artists for the most part. You know, you're passing through 6 Pueblos from Santa Fe to Taos. So what that tells us is that, you know, he found great inspiration in that work. That's what inspired him to create the work that he did, was being surrounded by his Native American art collection. You know, and in some paintings, I often even feel that his pots are almost more animated than his people, because to him they were living animate objects that represented this rich culture that he just wanted to absorb himself with. You know, he was reading up on the cultures. We have his library. It's largely an ethnographic library. So these artists were pretty enmeshed in that story. And that material culture that comes out of the West is unlike anything else in the world. And that's what draws these artists to the West, is that diversity and richness of material culture from the plains, plateaus, and the Southwest. And the Southwest is really that center of that Western material culture, and everything could be found locally. They didn't have to travel far to find amazing beadwork, because that was all being traded into Taos, and Taos Pueblo people were wearing that for ceremonial dress. So to answer your question, yeah, they were collecting for all of those reasons.
I have actually a question, Davison.
Yeah.
So in the collection, the Sharp Couse collection of pots, most of these are really what, 1880s to maybe 1910, right?
Yep.
So, which tells me he had an interest in the people and the current pottery that was being made at the time, because he would have had access if he wanted to early vessels, prehistoric, protohistoric, things that are in the 1840s, 50s. They choose not. They choose to get things that represent their time and day, which I think comes back to this whole question of collecting and what should be collected. There's great potters, your wife being one of them, that are making pots today that should be incorporated not only with maybe historic material, but other things too, because Taos founders were doing it, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Mark, is that they were collecting living cultures. They
Yes,
weren't collecting this vanishing race necessarily. They,
right.
their whole impetus was look at how alive this culture is and can, I mean, it's almost hard for probably Americans today to realize how alive these native cultures are, especially in New Mexico. But yeah, that's a really good point, is they're collecting living cultures. And I think that's the point for them was this is why we're here and this is the story that we want to tell. And yeah, that story is alive today as it was 100 years ago. And the Taos artists and the Santa Fe artists in particular, as well as Maynard Dixon, had a lot to do with creating that interest in native culture and creating a market. And of course, as we mentioned, it's also, the height of the Santa Fe Railway and marketing the Southwest and marketing those cultures.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mark. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think to see it, you have to be a person who understands pottery. And I was just thinking, that's really what they're doing. And you look at those great sharp pots, you put those beautiful San Juan and Santa Clara dough bowls filled with flowers. Those were turn of the century pots. They were done right then. I'm sure he lived with that, not only as using it in his art form, but also on a daily basis.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that period is one of the most dynamic in native pottery because of this market that evolves. And now the artists are responding to a market and they're experimenting more. They're looking at what other pueblos are doing, they're borrowing, they're experimenting, and that's really fun to see. And that's what Couse's pottery collection really documents, is that pre-tourism market to kind of the height of the tourist market. And so
Yes.
we see a lot of evolution during that period. And it's fun to see those artists not as static potters, but as avant-garde artists experimenting and growing.
Yeah, and there was a ton of them. Maria and Julian, Leela and
Yeah.
Van, you name the group of those early Margaret Tafoya, they're doing things that no one else had done. And that is continuing today with the Virgil Ortiz, and the Romero, just pushing the boundaries. I
Yeah.
guess we should let you talk, Michael, huh? Sorry.
Yeah.
No, no, you're going in a direction that we wanted to go already. So this is, I mean, I think it's a great natural sort of segue. This idea that Western art is on one trajectory, but also Native American art and some of the materials we're talking about, I mean, they're both kind of on their own tracks. Do you see where they sort of come together and also drift apart over the century, that we're talking about here? Because
Well,
I asked that because Western art is really like there's a lot of Western art that's really about tradition. It's about cowboys and cattle and landscapes and wildlife and some of these things. It's about sort of getting back to that place that people know and want. But some of the things that we're talking about with Native American art, with weavings and pottery and some of these artists are very forward thinking. They want to break free of tradition. They're sort of bound by some of it, but they also want to explore other things and they want to go outside of what they have known for so long. So I'm curious if those two genres of art, Western art and Native American art, have they come together or drifted apart, at all in the last 100 years?
I think they've come and gone and have been, the circuitous route the whole time. Quite honestly, I mean, Maynard Dixon said the true artists were the Native Americans. They're the ones that brought it from the earth. You know, he was the one who really felt that way, and I'm sure many other artists of the West did too. I can't speak for somebody like a Frederick Remington, who's on the East Coast, you know, living on the East Coast, and you have a Russell who clearly was living with the people and felt the people and collected and all that. But you know, you have to look at where Native arts was too. You know, let's just take it from the 1940s, 50s. You know, it was arts and crafts. You know, there was a few enlightened people who understand it was different than that. You know, Hewitt setting up, you know, and having Swaya and those kind of things. Clearly, they saw it as something else. But in the vernaculum, it was arts and crafts. And I'm not sure that cowboy art wasn't much different in some respects as well. You know, and that's what they would have called it, more of a folk art. You know, as far as anybody on the East Coast looking in, they would have said, you know, this is nothing. This is, you know, this is pedantry. And to some extent, you still see those kind of borders and walls that exist. If you, you know, when's the last great Western show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Well, they have had it. You know, they've had one for Indian and Native American arts. But, you know, I think what's really happening more is that you have a convergence of not only Western Native arts to a broader audience and a broader platform, but you also have the East Coast maybe recognizing something different as well, as that, you know, these are true art forms. These are what is America, quite frankly, right? What is American art? Well, I guess you could say it's abstract expressionist, Pollock, it's original, but if you want to get to the core of it, it's the West and Native arts. And, you know, Native arts, whether it's on the East Coast or West Coast, and Western art from the West. So to me, these things will continue to come together. And you see it in, again, Davison can really probably talk to you about this way better than I can, but in museum collections, I know we have an Indigenous wing now at the Tucson Museum of Art. You know, that's kind of a big deal. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that. I think Davison is, you know, they're the quintessential of what's happening with Native arts, and from not only historic, but also contemporary with the show they have coming up, which has both, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, thank you for the segue. And yeah, to bring it back a little, yeah. I mean, the Taos Society of Artists in particular, their impetus was to create a new American art. They never saw themselves as Western artists, and Western art didn't exist as a term back then. And you know, ironically, their impetus was to present this pluralist society that the West contained. That was a very diverse group of people, especially in Taos. But I would agree with you, Mark. I think they've always been on these kind of parallel tracks, and often they overlap, and sometimes they don't. But what's exciting to see is we are seeing more of that, and in the museum world is finally catching up with that as well. We're working with the with Colby College Museum of Art has a significant Taos collection, thanks to Peter and Paula Lunder, and we're working with them and their postgraduate fellows to reinterpret that collection. They're going to do a reinstallation in the museum, and they want to include both historic and contemporary Native stories and material culture. And that's really the trend we're starting to see in the museum world, is that can you really interpret paintings alone without that larger story? And that's exciting to see. And yeah, another good example is we have our big 7th biennial gala coming up in May. And because of the opening of our new Lunder Research Center, dedicated to early Taos art and contemporary artists who are inspired by that story, we're able to do a contemporary exhibition of 39 of what I think are the top, because I curated it, of the top contemporary artists. And that's a real healthy mix of painters, of Native American artists, everything from pottery to glass sculpture to jewelry to fashion. And we have a large number of Hispano artists, everything from Santos to textiles to painting, African American artists painting the West. And I think that's a real healthy trend, is starting to merge, is to tell that story through the diverse material culture, because that's what brings it back to this story several hundred years ago. is all these cultures and the physical manifestations of their traditions, their heritage, that we appreciate today, and that is just alive today again as it was 100 years ago, is what's really exciting. And we're seeing artists, there is this interesting paradox of drawing from your traditions and your culture while also, being very much a part of the modern world. But that's what's exciting about especially contemporary native art, is it is this, I don't want to even say it's a juxtaposition, it just is. It's a way of being and a way of expression that includes all of it, that makes collecting Native American art in particular very exciting right now, is because we're seeing artists really bust out of those boxes in every type of media. It's hard to imagine that 40 years ago, we started to see the first non-traditional pots. It wasn't that long ago that those traditional canons were really, really tight. And now it's a whole new bold world, and we're seeing a lot of Native American artists moving outside of that comfortable Native American art bubble. Cara Romero is a great example.
Yeah.
I mean, her photography could not be more imbued with her cultural background and upbringing. But man, doesn't matter what your background and knowledge base is, you look at one of those photographs and it stops you in your tracks.
Yeah, I agree.
That's
I think
exciting.
she's like one of the premium artists working today in any field. I don't care where you go. She's on my hit list, by the way, to get one.
Well, I'm glad you brought up your show, because yeah, your show's doing really exciting things by taking these very classic sort of Western artists, the artists that appear at a lot of the shows, have gallery representation all across the West, and you're putting them right there next to weavings and pottery and jewelry. And you're saying in a very bold way, this work has to be shown together to tell these stories. I think you're doing something really exciting, Davison. And Mark, if anyone is, I mean, your gallery, and to our listeners, if you've never been to Tucson and been into Mark's gallery, you should add it to your list of things to do. His gallery is amazing. At the front, there's paintings and bronzes, but in the back, there's weavings and basketry and pottery and jewelry. And I mean, deceased artists, living artists, contemporary artists. I mean, what both of you are doing in that respect is why this is the reason I brought you on. But I think that you get it. You're including more stories, and you're making the West a more exciting place to sort of collect art and view art. No question there. Just thanks for what you're doing. This is really great.
Sounds good. Sounds like a nice little plug I can put on my website.
Yeah, I like that. It's what we do.
I would like to know, are there things, especially Mark, because you sometimes probably go into homes to place artwork. You're helping out a collector, maybe they need something. You see collections firsthand, and I'm sure, Davison, you've seen collections in their, in homes. What are you seeing about how collectors are displaying work together? How are they taking this idea where Western paintings and bronzes and Native American blankets and pottery and other things like that, how they can be shown together? How are you seeing this work at the ground level in homes?
Well, one of the things I tell my clients when they are, trying to decide what to collect or how to decorate their home is really there's no rules, right? You can decorate it in any form or fashion you want, as eclectic as you like, whether it's modern, mid-century modern furniture and or paintings with, Native American pottery, baskets, rugs. It mixes. The only thing you really need is quality, right? That's what you're looking for. So that's the one thing that you want to see run through a collection, is to have a continuity of quality. Because if it's great, it's going to work regardless if it's a great big black Santa Clara pot next to a Mark Rothko painting, if you happen to have the luxury to own something like that. And in my own collecting habits, I have a modern home. It's a very contemporary home, and I have it mixed up with different things, from a Leonardo Drew sculpture next to two big W.R. Rawlins paintings from 1917, across from a Ed Mell, painting. So, I think it's important that people not pigeonhole themselves into, oh, I can't have this, that, and the other together, because it's just you're denying yourself the joys of great art and of many disciplines. And, you know, in my own collecting habits, in my own gallery, you know, you will find those. I mean, look behind me, you know, you have this wild abstraction next to T.C. Cannon drawings. So they work beautifully. It's just, I think, finding the thread of quality. And, you know, my own life, as far as what I put in my own home, I do try to find a continuity of design, and, you know, certain things work better. Maybe a T-Snows post doesn't work right next to, you know, Joseph Alber's piece. That's just, it may be too jarring, and hopefully you'll be able to have that sensibility to recognize that. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have it in a different way, like on the ground, on the floor, you know, and the Rothko up, or the Albers up on the wall. So, you know, I think it all works. We're seeing a change. I think it's a palpable change, quite frankly, in the way people collect and look at art, as well as the type of Western, so-called Western art that is being produced, at least from a painting standpoint. You know, I think, you know, you are seeing a change in how things are going. And, you know, you see the Emmy Whitehorses and the Mateo Romeros and different, you see things that are changing. And, you know, the Josh Gibsons and the, you know, the Logan Hages, you know, just go down the road, right? But that still also leaves places for a Mark Maggiore, you know, who does a more realistic type of rendering, though he could do it very loose if he choose to. But again, quality, right? So that's my
And,
two.
yeah, and to build on what Mark was saying, I mean, interestingly, American modernism in many ways begins with native art. That influx of New York artists that arrive in Taos in New Mexico, beginning with Andrew Dosberg in 1917 up to Agnes Martin, they're largely drawing inspiration from Rio Grande textiles, Navajo textiles, Apache basketry, Pueblo pottery. That those minimalist designs imbued with symbolic meaning in many ways fuels American modernism. We talk a lot about European modernism and Africa and Southeast Asia influence, but you know, in American art, we don't talk a lot about that importance and exposure of those New York artists coming to New Mexico and bringing that art back is a real pivotal moment in American art history, and that's largely Native American art driven, which is pretty interesting. The other thing I would say, talking about collecting, is I'm seeing a trend where collectors of Western and/or Native American art are really interested in the stories behind the art. I think they're going a deeper level than collectors were 20 years ago. And I'm seeing it. It feels to me, and maybe I'm just optimistic and naive, but it feels like we're moving away from stuff and we're moving more into stories. That people want to know the stories of the material, of the art, you know. And like Mark said, we've gone from native material being arts and crafts to now being recognized as fine art, you know, thanks to the Met and the Dykers in particular. And that's really healthy to see. It's taken us a long time to get there. We're no longer seeing it as purely ethnographic, but I feel like the collectors are a more engaged collecting audience that want to ask tough questions sometimes, and I think that's really healthy.
And that makes sense, right? We're in a social media sharing society now. It's changed,
Yeah.
right? And they want to have that interaction, not only with the artists, but with the dealers. You know, that's why you see people like me doing more video, so people can respond and see and hear the artist's own words and where
Mm-hmm.
their thought patterns come for what they want to do. And again, I would point out to Mark Maggiore, he's got 330,000, you know, followers on Instagram. I mean, that's a big megaphone that, you know, reaches a lot of people. And, you know, I'm sure he works his tail off to have to engage and talk and deal with all those individuals, you know, that want to know the story. They want to know the history. And I think you know, I really hadn't thought about it concretely like you are talking about, Davison, but I think that's exactly right, that they do want to know that. And it's important to be able to provide that. And as dealers, we should have to be able to do that. As museum directors, you know, are doing those kind of things. And as, you know, magazine writers, I mean, that's your first and foremost thing is content, and how do you provide that to your audience. And this is one way to do it, what we're doing right now.
Yeah,
So,
I would say, yeah.
oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, Mark Majori is a great example. You know, he moved to Taos a couple years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. He does a residency with us in the Sharp studio while we're closed. He starts to engage with the Taos story in a meaningful way. He engages with our archives. Now he's built relationships with native models at the Pueblo. He recently did research on Pueblo saddles, looking at our Couse collection of photography, 11,000 photographs that we just digitized thanks to an IMLS grant. And so he's putting those pieces together in a really fascinating way to see these contemporary artists, you know, inspired by, you know, this kind of mythic West of 100 years ago, but almost having a scholarly approach, but also doing it in a meaningful way where they're engaging with Taos Pueblo on a personal level. And Mark Majori is a great example in that he's giving back to the Pueblo. We created a Taos Pueblo Arts Education Fund, and he gives annually to that, as well as Parsons Gallery and ourselves. We fundraise annually, and we give money to the day school in particular to promote arts education. During the pandemic, we've been giving them art supplies because, of course, they need art supplies for home schooling. But yeah, I think it's a much more nuanced story that we're seeing today with these artists, and I think that collecting audience is interested in that nuanced story, and that's fun. I mean, that's where the real color comes to life, are those background stories of both the historic and the contemporary.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
You mentioned the Met, and I'd love to know, are there museums out there that you think have, I mean, really fascinating examples of what we're talking about, sort of that Western story and the Native American story coming together? Are there museums or collections that you know of that you feel like are perfect to that example?
Well, I think there are. I'm not sure if they're the museums that the East Coast would consider museums in the sense of what they think is, you know, that story. But I mean, starting on the East Coast with the James Museum in St. Petersburg, the Booth Museum in Cartersville, Georgia, the Idle George Museum, you know, in Indianapolis, and then make your way west, you know, and I think, you know, from Wickenburg to Tucson to the Herd to the Autry. I think the Autry does an amazing job of that, you know, so. And you know, maybe the best of all, or at least the most recent, is really making an impact would be Western Spirit, you know, the Scottsdale Museum of the West. You know, that's
Yeah,
another one that does it. You know,
yeah,
Davison has made the Sharp Couse, you know, Foundation and museums has made a huge impact and is making waves throughout. The fact that they can get so many good artists to show up for their show says that, you know, there's positive, you know, interest not only by the artists but by the public. So, you know, the question is, do you have others that are like that, like, you know, and the answer may be not so much. So if you look at, you know, the big museums on the East Coast, other than a few isolated examples, you know, it's still segregated, right? You know, it's still, you know, here's this room and, you know, all the other art's there. I think the Denver Art Museum's tried to change that too. But I mean, Tucson Museum of Art is a great example of really incorporating it all and having an indigenous wing. That's all new stuff, and a Hispanic wing too. And we can't forget the Hispanic component, at least in the Southwest, especially. It's
hmm
huge. Right? It's an important aspect, and also in the Miami area, in that area as well for Cuban art. So I think the big institutional museums, and again, Davison can talk to you about it better because he's right in that mix, but the big institutional museums, I think, maybe not have caught on yet, but hopefully they will. I think they're looking at indigenous art, you know. I don't know if they're looking at Western art.
yeah. I'd say that's a really good point. It's still compartmentalized on the East Coast, as far as I can tell. I would say Peabody Essex Museum is actually probably the most significant museum on the East Coast that's made inroads with that, with really tackling its historic collection and bringing in the native story, both intellectually and physically, into their exhibition space, and that's really exciting to see. But yeah, I would say Mark kind of listed all the major museums out west that are doing more of that. The Eiteljorg is a good example. You know, they have that the great what is it, that the Hennings painting of the twins,
Right.
that we all love, that I actually saw for the first time in Maine at the Portland Museum of Art before I knew anything about the Taos Society of Artists, and was completely blown away by that painting. And then they acquired the Susan Falwell large jar canteen of the twins, and they have them side by side, and it's a great conversation.
Great.
And
Yeah.
the public just loves it. I mean, I have people sending me photographs all the time and just being like, wow, what an amazing idea. And so it's really fun to see those moments happening, is starting to change how we interpret that narrative of the West. And it's happening, but it's, you know, we're still so used to compartmentalizing and putting native art in one area and putting quote unquote Western art in another. And it's going to be fun. I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot of those barriers broken down. And when you have Colby College in Waterville, Maine, breaking down those barriers, like, that's impressive. You know, that's real movement in the museum field that will influence other museums.
Yeah, I think that's right. And artists or gallerists, hopefully, like myself, are, you know, looking at it differently as well. I have a Susan Falwell tile right over in my office, in this office, 2 feet from me, next to a Maria box. You know, so you can see the difference. You know, the box is amazing because of its just simplicity and its uniqueness in design, which hadn't been done. And then, you know, then you have Commentary of Today's Society by Susan. I mean, you know, it's when when dealers, especially, I think, start recognizing this and showing it and displaying it and discussing it, that will translate to the collectors. And then when the collectors are doing this as well, museums have to take a stock and look at those kind of things, because they're going to be requesting it. You know, this idea of the twins at the Hennings painting with the pot, with the piece right next to it. I mean, that's exactly what we want to see. You know, that's exactly where, and I think that is where things are heading. The next generation is not going to allow us to put things in pigeonholes, nor should they.
No, exactly.
I'm glad both of you mentioned the Eiteljorg Museum, and I want to kind of mention them just briefly. They are undergoing right now a huge renovation on their American Indian collection, and it's going to be impressive. I have not seen it yet. It's happening now, but I did want to point out the museum title. The official title for the Eiteljorg Museum is the Eiteljorg Museum of American Indians and Western Art, and I've always admired that they put Western art second. You know, typically the Western art part goes first because we're talking about these compartmentalized genres, and the West usually happens first. And the Eiteljorg's like, nope, we're going to put the people who were there first. They get to be in the title first, and that of course is a wonderful collection. And anyone who has a chance to go see it when it's back open should definitely do that. What about on the smaller scale, museums of sort of the larger scale sort of picture? When it comes to acquiring work, I mean, Mark, you're a great resource for people. What should they be looking for with their material? Should collectors be conscious of the things they're looking at, sort of the sacred sort of nature of objects? Should they be talking to the artists more? Should they be, I mean, what should collectors be doing to just have a better and more informed collection?
Well, I think that's the answer, right? A better and more informed collection. You know, all the above. You know, if you can talk to an artist, if you can, you know, go to gallery openings, you know, when the artist is there. We're having Julia Areola is going to be doing a show in April. She's Apache, and she's doing this steampunk amazing material that takes old ledger paintings, old ledger drawing, just the paper itself from the 1850s, and then puts her own impression of steampunk ideology on it. So you have this modern and old combined from a native perspective, you know. And so we have a show. You can come down and visit her, see her, and talk to her, you know. And you know, you go to museum openings like what Davidson's going to be having in the middle of May, and you know, you read your books, you know, you read the magazines. I think Native American Art Magazine is a good example of seeing the whole gamut, primarily from a more contemporary point of view, but it's there. And, you know, you put them together, you put Western Art Collector and Native Magazine together, bundled together, so both views can be seen at the same time. It would be nice if it was, you know, even somehow combined. And that's something that maybe you guys have had discussions, you know, how do you bring Native arts into the Western Art Collector and Western Art Collector into the Native Art Magazine? So, but it is important to, I think, understand, and it's not just Native or Western, it's all art. You need to have an understanding of where it's coming from, right? And hopefully art should, and I've always felt this, provide some kind of an emotional response in yourself. That doesn't mean it has to be a joyful, happy one. It can be a sad, you know, angry one even, you know, but it should have some kind of response. And that to me is first and foremost what art should do. And then, you know, the rest of the story is up to you to either interpret on your own or to talk to the artist. And often the artist won't be able to really give you that concrete reason why it is or what it is. It came because it comes from a different place too. It comes from a guttural place, you know, that is, you know, it would be nice if we actually had an artist on this perspective right now and they could talk to that. But it comes from somewhere deep, and often I think what they have to say, they can't even espouse in real words. It's more of an emotional feeling. And if you see what they see, then they've succeeded as an artist. And that's what you should be shooting for as a collector, is trying to figure out and find, you know, what moves you and what you like, because you're going to live with it, right? And then if you happen to be able to understand the artist and the person and the point of view it may have come from, well, then that's just a great bonus.
And Davison, you know, you're around a lot of historic material. You know, you're connected in that way to the art market, but also just with your closeness to, you know, your wife, Susan Falwell, who's an artist. I see you at all the shows. You know, it seems like everybody. What are you hearing from collectors, or maybe what are you hearing from artists that maybe collectors should know when they sort of step into that world? Things they should consider as they start acquiring pieces. I mean, what are some things? Maybe you have some advice for young collectors or novice collectors.
I mean, yeah, I think Mark did a very eloquent job of you know, of speaking to that and to the emotional attachment. I think that's got to be first and foremost. Is, you know, the art has to speak to you. And then once you're moved by a piece, it's, yeah, you know, you want to do the research, you want to meet the artist, you want to find out their backstory and their inspiration. And I think it's that combination of education and emotion, that when you can marry those two things is when you really build your personal powerful collection, because you want those pieces to resonate. It's not, you know, it shouldn't be about collecting because someone told you this artist is important right now. If you don't walk in the room, and that's why, you know, like as a museum person, I sometimes like doing gallery guides rather than putting object labels up, because we're so human, we're so trained with our monkey brain that we walk in and you could be seeing, you know, Van Gogh's Starry Night for the first time, and you're going to walk up and read the label. Instead of walking into a room and having that experience with the art, we're so trained to go to that, that you really kind of need to remove yourself and just have that connection first with the art and then move on from that, because that's what it's all about. If it doesn't speak to you immediately, if you have to read a paragraph,
Right.
you know, that's something else. You know, the
And put
context
your
is
phone in your pocket
great.
too, you know, put your
Yeah,
phone in your pocket when you're
yeah,
looking,
yeah,
so you can look with your eyes and
yeah.
your heart.
In your
Yeah.
heart, exactly. I think that's really important.
We're going to chat for another 10 minutes or so, but I wanted to give our audience a chance. They can ask questions using the program here, this GoTo app. You can ask questions. You have to submit them via writing, but go ahead. If you have any, go ahead and start submitting those now, and we'll get to those here in a couple minutes. I'm excited we can kind of ask some more questions here and just kind of round up our conversation, but feel free to send those in now, and we'll get to them here in a minute. I'd love to know, since both of you are connected to the art market in really exciting ways, I'd love to know if there's anyone that you're watching right now with just sort of a renewed sort of enthusiasm, or someone who's just turning in really great work. Who are you excited about?
That's
Well,
a tough question. I'm excited about a lot of people.
I'll
Also,
have one.
you're probably friends with a lot of them too. I
I'll,
guess I imagine both of you are.
I'll tell you one, somebody I'm excited about that is, I have an upcoming show in March for Jill Carver. And I got to tell you, she wrote me this beautiful, eloquent email about how the pandemic and this one person show really has allowed her to reach new heights emotionally and mentally, and also translate that to what she's doing, where she's written specific interpretations of each piece of how much that piece meant to her and why she did it and how she did it. When an artist takes it to that level, I think you start to see breakouts. And to me, she's a breakout artist, and she shouldn't be a breakout artist because she's a great artist that's been there on the scene for a very long time. But just to read that email and to hear what she had to say about how meaningful it is to be able to provide, a wonderful body of work during a very difficult time, and to make it and have it really, she can see it in her art how it's changed, and she has this ephemeral sensibility that she's able to do in her artwork. And I think that's one other thing I would just point out in this conversation that we've kind of left off is women artists, especially in the West, and I think to some extent even in Native arts, but especially in Western art, have somewhat been put to the side. And we have to recognize that these individuals are every bit as equal, if not more, to their male counterparts. And that, you should be looking at women in the West, women artists that are painting, any artists, because, museums are definitely taking a look because they're under appreciated, underrepresented in the museum collections. I think the Baltimore Art Museum said for 1 year they were just going to only do acquisitions of female artists because they needed to catch up. And I think Jill's a great example of somebody who is, one of the top, and she deserves to be seen. So there's your answer, Jill Carver for me.
Wonderful. Davison, what's Susan working on at home right now? Is there anything in her studio?
Yeah, she's doing an all canteen show.
Oh,
So
great.
this is a first for her. She hasn't done a lot of canteens in a while. They're really popular. She did a fabulous one for our La Luz De Taos gala exhibition. In fact, the largest canteen she's done to date. Is pretty exciting. So yeah, that's what she's up to now. She has a show in April with King Galleries in Scottsdale. So, and she's still working on, she's still drawing inspiration from the Taos Society of Artists. She thought that would be, she thought she would run that well dry a while back, but because the body of work is so large and expansive, she's still having a blast investigating that work. And what's interesting is she's one of the only Native artists that are really mining that story, which is interesting. I mean, how many Native artists have done E.S. Curtis pieces inspired by response to, we even curated a show at the Arizona State Museum a while back that was specifically that, Native artists responding to the work of E.S. Curtis. But strangely, given how large the body of work is by the Taos Society of Artists, I have yet to see a real critical mass of Native artists engage with that story. So that's something I'm looking forward to, is seeing more artists grapple with that and interpret that.
Well, excellent. Thank you. Thank you both. I think we have some questions here. I'm going to turn to some of those here. I have one person who says she works 30 minutes from the Idle-Jorg and agrees it is an amazing place. And I don't know that it was said earlier, the Idle-Jorg Museum is in Indianapolis, Indiana, and it's right smack dab in the middle of downtown, and it's a beautiful museum, and it's just a great. I've kind of fallen in love with Indianapolis when I go there for that show, just to stay downtown, and there's several museums down there, so definitely worth a visit. The same responder, or the same person who asked that question asked, can you tell us more about the Colby College exhibit and what is the title on that?
I don't know if they have a working title right now, but I just know that they're in the process. They put together a group of postgraduate research fellows that are working with their curators and their staff to reinterpret the exhibition space. And we're hosting them in Taos in May to kind of do a deep immersion on Taos and working directly with contemporary Taos Pueblo artists and native artists to really engage with that story. But I don't know if they have a working title for the reinstallation at the moment. But it's really exciting to see them take this on in a real substantive way, and really want to reinterpret that in a meaningful way. And I think that's, I mean, it's seems obvious, but it turns out it's relatively groundbreaking.
Excellent. We have another question here. Why do you think collectors are more interested in Native American history versus cowboy history? I'm sure there's probably, you could probably debate that, whether they're interested in one more than the other, but do you feel like collectors are leaning a certain direction?
I don't personally. I think there's interest in both, quite
Yeah.
honest. I mean, just turn on, your TV and Yellowstone or 1883 or, what will you see? Cowboys and Indian magazine, or, the magazines you have. It may be the perspective that this person is seeing or seems to be seeing more things on Native, but, at least in my world, I wouldn't say that I see that being the case at all.
I have another good question here from viewer Mark Chase. Younger generations seem more focused on experiences as opposed to collecting, which we did sort of talk about a little bit. What are your thoughts on the future of collecting Native American artwork and that younger demographic? Of course, Mark, you know this question well. It's the $1 million question. How do you get young people involved in art? I'd love to know your perspective on this question here.
You do a podcast. That's one of the ways you do it. Right, honestly, you engage them in the platforms that they are that they use, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, all these platforms, podcasts being a very good one. That's how you grow an audience. That's how they find out about you, and that's how they get interested. And again, I'll go back to Mark Maggiore with so many of his followers. He engages with a lot of young people that do go out and see. And so artists that can do this kind of thing, are able to, and there's a lot that have done very good jobs with it. Logan is one, as well as Glenn Dean, and a lot of these individuals, Josh Elliott, there's a list of them, but they're doing the heavy lifting for some of the community, quite frankly, our community. Mm-hmm. And but and we could go into the other realm, we don't have time to, but which is NFTs, which is going to be the next, the Web 3.0 is coming, is here, and the art world is going to have to engage in it, including the Western Native art world is going to have to engage in it, and it's going to be, the sooner they get on board, the sooner they'll be able to make their case in the metaverse for what they are, and that's part of how it's going to go. And the dealers and the artists that embrace this and understand this are going to reach the greatest younger audience. So yes, it's about the art, but it's also in the coming generation about the culture and the whole dialogue that goes on with it. It's going to be deeper, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's their thing, and hopefully we can be a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think I don't entirely believe that millennials are going to remain experiential versus material, because it's just kind of the natural cycle. As in your 20s and 30s, you're traveling around, you're figuring out where you want to put down roots, but at some point you put down roots. And when you put down roots, you often want to engage with that larger story of where you live. And if you're, heading out west, there's a good chance you're going to engage with that story, which means you start educating yourself and you start collecting material that represents where you live and that identity. So I think it happens inevitably. I agree with Mark that in our social media world, the artists are doing a lot of that heavy lifting. They're engaging directly with their collecting audience, and they're bringing in a younger audience. You know, in places like the Couse-Sharp Historic Site, you know, we are an experience. We're an experiential museum. We're not a walk in and read object labels and look at art. We're come in and have an immersive experience on the story of Taos, and we're able to tell the story of Taos from a native perspective, an Hispano, and an Anglo artist perspective. And I think people will always respond to that. And quite frankly, we need more of those experiences and less digital mediated experiences in our modern world.
Yeah, and you're
I do like
responding
that we,
too, right? I mean,
yeah.
you're responding to what the people want and trying to embrace a younger group or just a group through recognizing that there are things that need to be done experientially. And yeah, I think, you know, the experiential thing, we take it as, especially as baby boomers or, you know, Gen Zs or whatever, we look at it as, you know, this thing that's only about social media and content. But I believe it's deeper than that. I think it's a societal thing that we're connected. It's more of an interconnected kind of thing. I don't see that going away. I think that interconnection that people feel through social media and through their own communities will only get stronger and grow. And to really tap into it, we have to have a story for those individuals, all of them, not just one little segment, but the whole group, you know, and it'll be interesting. It's going to be fun to watch.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you both are right there on ground level. We're you know, involved with it in every way I can imagine right now, whether it's museums or galleries or artists. You're right there, and I really appreciate both of your perspectives on all of this. It's been really just a pleasure listening to both of you and having this conversation. So thank you so much for being a part of this show and for also working with us on the magazine. It's always great to have you in our pages.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you, Michael. Always a pleasure.
Definitely. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. We're happy to bring this to you today, but we also definitely want to make sure that you check out the American Indian Art Show San Francisco and the San Francisco Tribal and Textile Art Shows. Those are going on right now. They're virtual. Definitely check them out. The shows run through the 28th. You can see Mark's work there. Mark's gallery is going to have offerings there, so check those out. And Davison, give us some dates for La Luz De Taos.
Yeah, so our La Luz De Taos Biennial Gala exhibition opens March 8th here at the London Research Center in Taos. And then our Biennial Gala is May 20 through the 22nd. You can find more information on Couse-Sharp.org or laluzdetaos.org. So please check it out on the website. We'll have the entire exhibition online as of March 5th. And I should mention the entire exhibition is for sale as a fundraiser for the Couse-Sharp Historic Site, our mission, vision, and programs. And I could not be more humbled by the support and generosity of the artists and the galleries that have made this possible. It's a really exciting show. So if you can't get to Taos in person, please check us out on the website.
Excellent. Thank you both. And I encourage everyone to participate in these virtual shows. And then the ones that are in person, attend those. Love the ones like the Couse-Sharp Historic Site, and visit Mark at Medicine Man Gallery in Tucson. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.